So Chapter 3 focuses on prenatal development. So the first period of prenatal development is the germinal period. And so here you have a diagram of the body parts related to the reproductive system that is involved in the germinal period. You can see the female is standing up, so her vagina is at the bottom and her cervix, and the major part of what you see is the uterus. And then the two bulbous structures on the left and right are the ovaries. And on the right of your screen, they've cut the ovary in half to show that an egg is maturing, and it erupts from the ovary. And it's an oocyte, that's what they call an individual egg. And then it goes into the fallopian tubes, which are the finger-like structures next to the ovary. And it looks like in this case, this egg was fertilized by a sperm soon after it enters the fallopian tubes. And it begins dividing. First of all, it becomes a zygote when it passes the curve and gets to the top of the tube. And then you can see closer to the center of the screen, it's divided into two, and then it's many cells, and it becomes a blastocyst. Once it enters the uterus, and you can see where it's entered there, and then it implants in the uterus, and it's best if it implants in the upper third of the uterus. And so there are 3 stages of prenatal development. There's the germinal period. We just looked at the beginning of that. Then the embryonic period and the fetal period. And the zygote is sperm and ovum united. And the germinal period begins when the zygote is created, and that develops into a blastocyst. And the embryonic period begins with the embryo as a cluster of cells inside the blastocyst. And so here's the embryo and its supporting structures. So let's take a look at those. The chorion surrounds the amnion and connects on the top side through the umbilical cord to the placenta. The chorion is the outer layer of the blastocyst developed into the amniotic sac, which contains the fluid in which the embryo will float, and chorion. The placenta allows nutrients, oxygen, hormones, and other substances to cross into the embryo's bloodstream, and the processes waste and takes it away from the embryo. And so you can see this blastocyst implanted in the upper third of the uterus, and the placenta is all across the top, which is an ideal situation. So in implantation, the zygote adheres to the uterine wall and actually digests some of that away in order to implant. Twins may form during the germinal period, and so monozygotic twins would be identical twins like the two you see here. Dizygotic twins would be non-identical twins. So identical twins have identical genetics, where dizygotic twins have different genetics, but familial similarities. So the embryonic period begins at 2 weeks. So the germinal period lasts for 2 weeks. At the end of those 2 weeks, the period begins, the embryonic period begins, and it goes till 8 weeks after conception. The blastocyst attaches to the uterine wall, and then the mass of cells, once it's implanted, is called the embryo, and there are 3 layers to the embryo in the beginning. There's the endoderm, which is the inner layer of cells, and this later becomes the digestive and respiratory systems. There's the mesoderm, and you can remember that because it's the middle layer because middle and mesoderm start with M. This becomes the circulatory system, bones, muscles, excretory system, and the reproductive system. And then the ectoderm is the outer layer, which includes the nervous system and the brain, the sensory receptors, ears, nose, and eyes, and skin parts, hair, and nails. So then in the embryonic period, there's implantation. It goes from the implantation through the 8th week of pregnancy. This is the most vulnerable period of development because all of the major organs and body parts are established in their basic rudimentary forms. During the embryonic period, there's development of the primitive cardiovascular system, the formation of the neural tube, and if there are issues, there could develop neural tube defects that may result in spina bifida or anencephaly. And so here's a pictorial depiction of the formation of the neural tube. So anencephaly is the absence of a major portion of the brain, skull, and scalp, and it's a neural tube defect. There is, and then there's another issue that's a neural tube defect that's characterized by anemocephaly, which is a bony defect of the spine and exposure of neural tissue as a result of the skull failing to form. And then spina bifida is a birth defect where there is incomplete closure of the backbone and membranes around the spine. And the most common location of that problem is in the lower back. So those are some issues that might happen during the formation of the neural tubes. So the life support system, as we talked about a little bit earlier, that they develop rapidly during the embryonic period. The amnion is the bag or envelope containing clear fluid in which the developing embryo floats. The amniotic fluid provides an environment that is temperature and humidity controlled as well as shock-proof. The umbilical cord contains 2 arteries and 1 vein and connects the baby to the placenta. And the placenta is a disc-shaped group of tissues in which small blood vessels from the mother and the offspring intertwine but do not join. And remember, in the photo we looked at earlier, the placenta was in the upper part of the uterus. So here is another depiction of the placenta and the umbilical cord. And you can see here, it's not quite in the upper part of the uterus, but it's not in the lower, more dangerous portion. But you can kind of see how the placenta is organized with the blood vessels and arteries. So the third period is the fetal period. This starts at 9 weeks after fertilization and goes until 38 weeks or delivery. The physical development gains include facial features, functional limbs, the vernix and the lanugo, which is hair on the body. And vernix is a waxy substance that protects the skin from the amniotic fluid. By 7 months, the organs all function. The lungs is the last organ to fully develop. And in the last 2 months, the fetus develops fat on its body to regulate body temperature outside the womb. And the mother passes whatever antibodies they have to the fetus. And so there's an advantage to being vaccinated because you can pass that on to your baby. The fetus moves around in the womb. It develops sensory abilities and behaviors to adapt to the outside world. So it can taste things that foods the mother's eaten, because often they get into the amniotic fluid. They blink, they cry, they have patterns of sleep and wake, and they can hear. And so they become familiar with voices from the outside, and they can see light coming from the outside as well. There are 4 main processes of brain development. There's neurogenesis, there's neural migration, there's neural differentiation, and there's formation of neural connections. So neurons are the basic information processing cells of the brain. They begin production in the 5th week through neurogenesis. Glial cells are specific cells that support and nourish the neurons and remove waste products away from the neurons. During this period, there is neural migration. So the neurons move from the center of the neural tube out to form the brain. And so they travel along different pathways. Neural differentiation, neurons genetically are pre-programmed to go to specific areas in the brain, and they travel along pathways. Synapses are a way for neurons to communicate with one another, forming neuronal networks. And so here's a chart that depicts the neuronal development. So here's 28 days. Here's 50 days. The looks closer, the forebrain expands and covers the midbrain. 100 days, the cortex begins to take shape and grows around the inner areas of the brain. 20 weeks, a continuing growth of the cortex, and the purple structures at the top of the neural tube are the brain stem and the cerebellum. 28 weeks, the migration is complete at this point, and the major structures of the brain are present in primitive forms. And 38 weeks or full term, the brain of a full-term baby has all the major structures of the adult brain, but will not reach a mature functioning for 20 to 25 years. At 6 weeks, genetically male and female embryos have the same genital structures. So they look exactly the same. Male fetuses have SRY gene on the Y chromosome. This gene turns on at 6 weeks and starts forming the testes. Female fetuses have lower testosterone levels, and so they degenerate the male structures, and develop female internal organs. And so here's a picture of 6 weeks, and you can see the male and females are identical. And in the second trimester, production of testosterone by the testes causes the top end of the structure to develop into a penis, and the middle of the structure to develop into the scrotum in the male on the right. And you can see that the female, her structures are getting smaller rather than larger and more differentiated. And then by birth, if testosterone is not present, the top end becomes a clitoris, and the middle becomes the inner and outer labia and the opening of the vagina. And so you can see that it's absorbed in. So complete androgen insensitivity, males can develop female external genitalia if they are insensitive to the effects of testosterone. So you can see they're not going to develop in the same way. Congenital adrenal hyperplasia is females can develop more masculine external genitalia if exposed to too much testosterone. So when things go awry, these situations can happen. And so here we have the 3 trimesters of prenatal development depicted, and so you can, but it's divided up so you can see what happens in each of the trimesters in 3 different periods of time. So you can take a look at those, and then there's a picture that represents that period there.